A few people just came, tried to intervene, whatever. I don't know exactly what happened. At the point, Juan Carlos was just like, Joan is having problems. He was like, just leave me upstairs, and I talked to friends. No, I have so much because we have been working for the last 4 years on code of conduct, and most of the policies implements are done. Something I have no tolerance for gravages. Joan is saying that he's not that drunk, but everyone can see that the guy was wasted. So I have to look for his jacket that he didn't know where he put it. Edwin never didn't know either. So he was like, fuck.
Excuse me, are you the moderator?
Yes.
I'm Alex.
Hi, I'm Alex.
Oh, hi, nice to meet you. Do you know if you have an
All
online?
the places.
Sorry, I was moderating, so I'm not the one organizing the session. It was my colleague here. I don't know.
Because the online moderator, I want to deal with the chat and the online participants, and the online moderator have to forward to the audience the
Okay.
and questions. So you need an online moderator who would be the connection between me and the computer and you moderator.
Okay.
So if you don't find a person, then I'll have to do it.
Okay. Let me check with Nick.
Yes, sure, perfect. Yeah. Just for you to keep in mind that we may have some online
Yeah.
questions.
Okay.
Came in with this other guy that was because we were stuck at the main entrance. And then I ran for a session that I had upstairs. And they also because they were only 5 people because everyone was stuck at the except Alex because she has a new badge and you because you have a new badge.
No. I walked up with my colleagues.
You walked with him?
She caught up with me and I was like, I'm not going to leave her to walk up the hill on her own. I don't know if I would have done it yesterday. I have to admit.
Let me go to the bathroom before we start.
Porque nunca le haya llegado la... Qué raro que no la pueden...
Maybe it's up to you. There's space.
Hi, how are you? The same.
This is an early panel. You're ready.
Yeah.
You got 15 minutes. You're just ready
Which
to
is
go.
super key.
Come on. Panel could start, it could be like you have day 0. Be like panel 0.
I know. Yeah.
The moderator asking whether we have an online moderator.
We do. Yeah. He's or she's coming. Online, right? Oh, here. Yeah.
No.
No, you don't.
Oh, and we don't have a remote moderator.
No, online. So somebody here that's in charge of following what's happening.
We don't have it.
Kim, can you be our remote moderator or you have to live in the middle? Yeah? So then you need to sit here, I think, yeah?
Yeah, it's good if
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Pode ser?
This is kind of urgent panel. All the confirmed panelists just backed out. So all our new panelists.
Oh, really?
Yeah. You know? Just last minute refusals.
It's all right. We've got such an amazing pool
Yeah.
of experts that it's possible. We can do this.
So I'll have to leave like by 11:40.
That's fine. Yeah. But it's great that, like all of you agreed at the last minute. Like all of Oh, thank you.
Did you get your beanie?
I did, sure.
And what do you think?
Is that
I
something
shoved
then?
it in here,
Wait,
but I think it's...
could you? I think the way you is the online moderator.
Yes.
This is quality.
Okay, then.
Yeah, no, the quality is
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. So should I sit here and sit here? Okay, I can sit here.
Yeah.
All right, cool.
I might put it in
I'll
somebody's
just go
Secret Santa. I'll be like, look, here's a great hat from the IGF. Yeah, people, yeah.
So would you tell her how to do this online moderation?
Você já fez, né?
Here?
Yeah, because
Oh.
the online moderator.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
It's like 15 minutes.
Deixa eu ver.
Were you able to put the webpage up? Okay.
Ah, ok. Thank you.
It looked like this. Now I see it. Now I'm like, ah.
Você sabe qual é o link? Para o streaming?
A Alexandrine tweetou. Se eu...
Okay, everyone, we're going to get started. I think there was a slight change from the program online to then the program that was printed, so apologies to people who thought that it would start at 10:40, but we're starting now a little bit early, ahead of 11 o'clock. So my name is Alex. I work for Privacy International, an organization based in London, and we advocate, litigate, and do research on the right to privacy, working with an international network of partners as well. And I'm really happy to be moderating this session today with this distinguished experts sitting next to me who will be exploring through their different contexts and the work that they're doing at the national level. What does it mean to be, who is on the margins, and who are these individuals who are subject to surveillance? And in terms of on the margins, what we're exploring is individuals who are already in vulnerable positions or who are already experiencing exclusion or discrimination or stigma in their different countries, either at the national level or local level, and how they're experiencing different facets of surveillance that we're seeing occurring across the world. So I'm going to hand over to David Kay, who's the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression and freedom of opinion of the UN, and he'll be helping us to frame the discussion that we'll have for the next hour before hearing from our national experts. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks Nigat for organizing the panel as well, and thanks to everybody who's here. Whether you thought it was at 10:40 or 11, I guess it doesn't really matter. So I only want to speak for a couple of minutes because there's such great people on the panel who will talk about the impact of surveillance on national communities and local communities. I think we tend very often to think about surveillance from the sort of the large-scale sense of how surveillance operates, what its purpose is, how it's connected to maybe large-scale counterterrorism operations and so forth. But one of the things that we've seen over the last several years is essentially a decentralization of the surveillance industry, right? So if we go back to 2013 and we think about the time of the Snowden revelations, and also totally coincidentally, it was the time that my predecessor, Frank LaRue, issued his report on surveillance and freedom of expression. We go back to that time, and much of the conversation about surveillance was essentially the broad scale, the broad scope of surveillance, particularly by the United States and its partners in intelligence operations, and also the broad scope in the context of how surveillance operated to sweep in vast amounts of data without respect to individual privacy, freedom of expression, freedom of opinion, other fundamental rights. I think one of the things that's changed over the last couple of years, while that is still an ongoing conversation and an ongoing debate, we've seen, particularly through the work of organizations like Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto, exactly how surveillance has moved from this mass surveillance that Snowden disclosed, which again still exists, but moved also to highlight how individual companies around the world have made spyware, surveillance technology, available really to anyone who can afford it, and the price is dropping. And we've seen this in particular in places that are repressive, and where the tools of surveillance that are purchased from companies around the world, but in particular from Western Europe, where those tools are being used to highlight the work and to target the work of journalists, of activists, of regular individuals who might be for one reason or another, in a position of dissent from government. I just spent about 10 days in Mexico, where the sort of the hacking and surveillance of mobile phones, by mobile phones owned by journalists, by public officials, even by international actors, it was a real scandal. And yet, the possibility of actually dealing with it and facing up to the reality of this kind of surveillance and the lack of any kind of regulatory environment to deal with this kind of surveillance has become more and more obvious, I think. So I think it's useful, at least for us, and I think this panel will really focus in on how surveillance has moved from this mass set of surveillance to very targeted surveillance that has a very direct impact on individual expression and on individual privacy. And I think that one of the questions that we should be addressing is not just, which I think we'll get to here, the question of who's impacted, how are people impacted, and what rights are influenced and undermined by this kind of very personal, direct, targeted surveillance, but also what kind of regulatory mechanisms should we be talking about to deal with the spread of this kind of technology. And a sort of a corollary to that question is whether it's even possible to restrict its spread, because obviously it's the kind of technology that may not be subject easily to the kind of restrictions that other forms of surveillance might be subjected to. So I'll just close there. I'm looking forward to hearing everybody's input and also really encourage people to be thinking about these questions, not just of who's impacted, which I think this panel will get to, but what are the solutions that we might be adopting to undermine it? How can we do it at the local and national levels? And what are the international tools that we might have to deal with this kind of surveillance? Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for this introduction. And I think you raised quite a few important points, particularly in terms of your mandate working on freedom of expression. You've been able to connect it to other fundamental rights, including the right to privacy. And I think that's something within the UN mechanisms that we need to do increasingly, because we can't be talking about these fundamental rights in isolation, because they're all interconnected. So it's great to see those initiatives as well. So thank you. I'm going to hand over to Joana Varon, who's a Brazilian researcher and advocate and founder and director of Coding Rights in Brazil. And she'll be talking about the work that they've been doing on mega events and the legacies of some of the surveillance technologies and systems that have been put in place in Brazil. Thank you, Joana.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, everyone, for the invitation. So I'm going to show you quickly work that we have done at Coding Rights. This is a timeline in which we mapped the changes in the legal institutional environment that allows for surveillance practices. So, and how it changed after a series of mega events that were announced in the country. So here, if you can see, before we had just the law on interception of telecommunications and some regulations from Anatel, the telecom regulatory agency, money laundering legislation, and the Brazilian intelligence system. But then we had the announcement of the Olympics, the World Cup, Pan American Games, here. And this is what happened right after. In green, you can see the new institutionalities that were created, but also new legislation that were created that both the legislation allow for other practices or other agencies to engage in surveillance activities, while the institutionality that was created, broadly speaking, was mostly about centers that would put together those agents, like the Centers for Operation in Rio, but also the cyber for cyber security, and then the Integrated Center for Command and Control. So what happened was that before, while we had different surveillance powers according to the agents, like this short infographic says ABIN, which is the intelligence agency in Brazil, could have some powers, while the police and judiciary were the ones that have more surveillance powers concerning access to user data, undercover, providing investigations with undercover agencies, breach of confidentiality, interception of communication, or even OSINT or use street-level surveillance. It was all separated, but then for those mega events that they got together in these centers for command and control. And we have no clarity about how they are sharing the data and perhaps data that they could not or shouldn't have access to. And then during those events and after, we could see that the new legislation, we had a legislation on anti-terrorism that was pushed for the World Cup, but we also approved the legislation on criminal organizations, a penal legislation. And this particular piece of law is being used to target social movements. So we have cases in which people from the landless workers movements have been targeted, but also organizations that defend human rights. And to end my presentation and connect a bit with what David was saying, so we could see in this research a change in the legal institutional scenario in one hand. In the other hand, the country also became a huge market for the surveillance industry. So many of the fairs for the industry, Hacking Team, Finfisher, it started to happen in the city. We went there and they like sell their solutions, and the country actually bought a lot of things. We try to use FOIA requests, but it's hard to get a sense on the materials, particularly those pertaining to surveilling internet, because we also approved a bill that that's about, how do you say, licitações, public purchases that exempts government officers to declare that they have bought surveillance equipment. So it's very hard to have a sense on what they have spent on. But then if we go to those cases and analyze the investigation practices, then you see Facebook, what they say, virtual patrol, that's being used through Facebook. So you go to this is one file in part of the process that's accusing protesters during the World Cup, but then here is another one against the Institute for Human Rights Defenders, and they include that they are monitoring their Facebook pages and requesting WhatsApp. There were a case in which, through monitoring, intercepting communications, they got the password of people from the password in other social networks and managed to enter. So this is a field that's not properly regulated, and we never approve. While we have all these new bills, we never approve a bill on data protection. So all this pervasive legislation are happening in one hand. In the other hand, we might have bought a lot of equipments that we don't know how they are being used. And then third thing is the extensive usage and monitoring of the social networks and requests for accessing WhatsApp. WhatsApp has been blocked in Brazil once because of that. And to finish, now we have this new trend. Due to the whole discourse about fake news, our Supreme Court for Elections have assembled a committee that has the army, the intelligence, the Brazilian intelligence agency, together with that court, to search for fake news and fake profiles in the social networks. And I think that this trend, and they are even talking to the US, representatives from FCC, and Federal Electoral Commission, not the FCC. And I think that in this scenario that we develop for the Olympics, adding this layer in a country that had a coup, and added this layer of monitoring in the elections involving the army and the intelligence that are related to the executive, it's another very harmful trend if we think about surveillance and democracy, the future of democracy in the country.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, John. I think John's presentation and the context in Brazil really highlights some of the systemic issues that we're seeing when it comes to surveillance, in terms of the lack of transparency of the regulations, what's in place in terms of the legal framework, but also the capabilities of government and who can then access those. Maybe, in view of the Olympics and the World Cup, Brazil was able to make the case to its citizens, but also to oversight mechanisms in terms of it was necessary for them to take those measures to ensure, national security and social order. But what happens afterwards? What's the justification? And how do we work to dismantle such systems that have been put in place? And even though there's little information of what has been purchased despite efforts from Coding Rights and other organizations, there's huge amounts of money being spent on this. And so it's very unlikely that they would dismantle them after one event. So what remains and how is that going to be used? And I think the examples in terms of how this has now been used to undermine other fundamental rights, including freedom of assembly, but also just generally civic engagement when it comes to electoral processes as well and democracy. So these all, what I was saying earlier in terms of we can't be speaking in isolation about these rights, but once one is infringed or interfered with disproportionately, it's very likely that it will interfere your enjoyment of other fundamental rights. So thank you, Joanna, for that. I'm going to hand over to Nigat, who is the organizer of this session with her organization, This Rights Foundation, based in Pakistan. So the Digital Rights Foundation has been working for 4 years now, 5 years, almost. 5 years. And Nigat's a lawyer and human rights activist in Pakistan. And Digital Rights Foundation has been pioneering this work in Pakistan and working at the intersections of internet freedom, women, gender issue, and technology. So Nigat's going to share her experience on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. So I'll be talking about the gendered nature of surveillance, particularly in societies as conservative as Pakistan. When we talk about surveillance, we mostly talk about the larger issue, the surveillance that comes from state or the big tech companies, and we tend to forget the voices of the marginalized community or the vulnerable communities who are not even heard in spaces like these. And after working for years in the area of digital rights, we have realized that surveillance isn't an isolated issue anywhere in the world. We tend to talk about the state and big tech companies, but we often forget the communities who are most affected and don't even have voice against this violation. And when we add an extra layer of gender to it, we see how it plays out against those minorities and marginalized groups or individuals that are already constantly fearing for their safety in public domains. Pakistan has particularly been insensitive towards the gender and sexual minorities, along with other kind of persecution that we frequently witness back home. And while we are talking about surveillance, I'll be focusing on how culture and tradition plays out in conservative societies like ours. The surveillance that starts from our home, when we are not allowed to lock our doors, to when our brothers checks our mobile phones, or answers our calls because he claims, or the male elder of the family claims that he is our guardian and should protect us at all costs. The surveillance at home translates into larger social surveillance when our neighbor are keeping an eye on us. Our relatives are constantly dissecting our choices of clothes, the people who hang out with us, and calculating every minute when we are not at home. If I talk about women here from the perspective of Pakistan, we have normalized this behavior within our own heads. And I have, yeah, so, I'm sorry, I just raised the point. Yeah, so a woman was, in our society, a woman has been given a rationale always for being watched, that they trust her, but they don't trust the world. So that their own trust issues manifest on the woman and confine her life in a glass ceiling. The main argument of our IT minister while lobbying for a draconian cybercrime law last year was the same, that we need to protect our daughters and sisters who are committing suicides because of online violence against them. Now this law is enacted and mainly being used to surveil and crack down on political dissent. Surveillance that stems from home translates into larger social discourse, and that affects the entire personality of the surveilled individual. An abusive partner who controls your entire life, including your mobility, who you talk to, who you work with, is as worrying as a hacker accessing your webcam remotely and filming you while you navigate your private space. The violence that each kind of surveillance, social surveillance, state and non-state surveillance result in are interconnected. We speak about how there shouldn't be mass surveillance by the state and non-state level, and how this is illegal and whatnot, but they still happen. And when they do happen, you don't know who is watching you or taping your phone at any given moment, and who has access to your data at all times. In Pakistan, this is rather a common occurrence, where someone breaches the domains of your authority and contacts the surveilled woman to moral police them, saying that she's like their sister and how she shouldn't meet a man or a person who they don't like. The idea that only a sister and or mother should be protected is also problematic, because it puts others at risk. Power dynamics always play their part. This person has your private information at their disposal, and you don't know what they'll do with this information, so you don't want to be rude to them, because social surveillance and your conditioned habits of being the torch bearer of family's honor is at play here. The lack of good governance and legislations make things worse, because there's no data protection law, and the available laws legalize reasonable surveillance without defining reasonable. We as women activists and journalists become more vulnerable to these watchdogs, moral policing women, when we are at the forefront of a movement with no protection at all. We'd like to defy all the power dynamics, but I think this becomes tricky when the power that we are attempting to challenge is not just one person, but a whole society that likes to keep a tight grip on how women are supposed to behave. And it's so important when we talk about the right to privacy, the culture, the tradition that we experience in our societies. It's so important to look at those cultures, because this culture, the religion, the tradition basically play out while making legislations and laws in countries like Pakistan.
Thank you, Nigat. I think that the context in Pakistan provides an interesting perspective of the need of not just looking at state surveillance, but also social surveillance. Sorry, I don't know if anyone heard me there. I think that the context in Pakistan just provides an opportunity to be exploring different facets of surveillance. When looking at social surveillance, and particularly when we know that the policymakers that are supposed to be drafting these laws that are meant to protect us are members of that society. And so if we want better laws, we also need to be working on the individual level, on societal level, to ensure that this is translated into legal safeguards, but also tech safeguards and enforced. And I think, as David was saying earlier, there's a lot of focus on state surveillance, and then we tend to focus less on social surveillance and things that are probably nearer to us for a lot of not just women, but different groups in society that are being marginalized or being discriminated against. So thank you, Nika, for that. I'm going to hand over to Amalia, who works for Fundación Charisma in Colombia. She is originally from Puerto Rico, and she's a project coordinator and researcher at Charisma. Previously, she was working on issues of freedom of expression and protection of journalists, which ties in well with her presentation today, where she's going to be presenting some of the work that Fundación Charisma has been doing on women journalists and privacy. Thank you, Amalia.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Alex. Yes, I wanted to share an experience we have in Charisma, a project we implemented 2 years ago where we wanted to understand how female journalists, women journalists experience digital violence, digital surveillance, and to identify manifestation of misogyny on the internet and its consequences. But, well, in a country like Colombia, where journalism is still a high-risk profession, threat and violence against this group have been normalized. But it does not recognize when journalists are suffering gender-based violence or gender-based surveillance, and this is what we wanted to explore with this project, because the digital violence targeting women journalists are often different from those of their male colleagues. In Colombia, violence, including surveillance activities against journalists, is understood as part of their job by the type of surveillance, but the type of surveillance experienced by women and men who practice this profession are not recognized and or distinguished. And the reality is that there is a difference between cause, the job, and the forms, the discourse is used. Or online surveillance against women journalists is looking into the woman journalist's personal and family relationship, who is her partner, if she has kids, and so on and so forth. In addition, it's pay attention to her physical appearance and intellectual ability to use it against her. But above all, it is very much sexualized, where the body is the weapon and the battlefield. This surveillance that most of the time take the form of an intimidation does not fall on ideas or arguments, but rather on the fact that it's a woman who speaks out and expresses her opinion in public spaces. We conducted several focus groups with female journalists from around the country, and the discussions we have with this group show that being victim or just knowing a woman victim of digital attacks has an effect on their own journalistic practices and the woman's behavior on the internet, particularly when it turns into self-censorship. Some of the consequences identified were that some women journalists decided to close accounts in social media or other public media, are more careful about what to say and what to publish, have asked for changes of sections in the media outlets they work, are using pseudonyms or alter egos to prevent the public debate from becoming personal or violent, or have decided to abandon the journalistic scene temporarily or permanently. The fear that this threat will materialize is the engine of these changes of habit, causing high level of stress, loss of income, and even their jobs. This also has the effect of reducing the representation of women journalists, of women in digital journalism. But even more, it encourages self-censorship, preventing society from hearing female voices in journalism and reducing the participation of women to not so public spaces or resonate in an era where technology is crucial for journalism. When we talk about how female journalists experiences differ from their male counterparts, we can highlight that the aim is to generate anguish, damage, and desestabilize the victim's self-esteem and generate fear about what can happen to her or her loved ones. When surveillance is carried out on a female journalist, there is no doubt that the gender stereotypes come into play, with sanctions or aggravate expressions coming out from social cultural norms. That is, those that confirm the relationship of male domination and female subordination. The experiences also differ when we think about what triggered most of the surveillance against female journalists. There is a misconception that women are better suited to cover sub-subjects of social, cultural, or entertainment issues. Instead, male journalists are better at dealing with hard news, that is, politics, judiciary, sport. The moment a woman covers any of these hard topics, she becomes a stated target of a mostly male audience. This is why their experiences are so different from what triggered the surveillance or the attacks, the form mistakes, and the consequences. And what I've been talking about is just a small sample that barely scratches the surface. How technology can be used to compromise women's privacy, how does surveillance from different actors affect them, how can government mainstream gender into internet-related legal framework and practices to address this concern? These are all questions that need to be considered and confronted. There is an urgent need to understand them in order to face them and provide better solutions to empower women and promote substantial changes.
Thank you, Amalia, for sharing that perspective. And I think what the case in Colombia reflects is the need to be looking at what is our problem analysis, because there are different layers that you're talking about. It's not only being journalists, but it's being female journalists covering issues that may be seen as more controversial. And then the implications as well vary. There's the infringement on the right to privacy, but then that leads to other implications in terms of sexual harassment and other types of violence as well. And so all of the different contexts that were shared are very different. And so it raises the question as to whether a one-size-fits-all solution is possible, given how different every context is, the actors that are involved, the targets of those violations or interferences with rights. And so what does that mean in practice if we're going to be advocating for better safeguards at those different levels? And I know David has to go in a few minutes, but before he goes, I wanted to see if he had any final reflections on the three presentations.
Well, I guess I would say a couple of things. So one is, I think each of the presentations really demonstrated a kind of change in surveillance, and also a change in the way we should be thinking about surveillance. I do think it's really important to be thinking. Well, I think certainly in a forum like IGF, we're extremely focused on digital surveillance. But digital surveillance, as I think Nigat's point made maybe most clearly, digital surveillance is part of a broader set of surveillance tools. There's still physical surveillance. There's still very personal surveillance, whether it's family or cultural or local government. And I think it's important for us to step back and put the digital surveillance that many of us have been focusing on into that broader context, because actually dealing with and addressing the problems that I think everybody up here has addressed requires not really just digital solutions. They require broader solutions that that get at surveillance as a general matter, not just as a digital one. So.
Great, thank you. Thank you for those reflections. And we're going to actually open up to the floor now to give us an opportunity to have the discussion as well. So if there are any questions for our four panelists, please switch on your microphone and maybe introduce which area you work in. You don't have to give your name. Anyone? Questions? Oh, people are being shy on this second day of the IGF. Yeah, please go ahead.
Hello, Fabian from the Copy Fighters. So, have you been researching some about the new EU copyright reform? Because the Article 13 in that reform would require all platforms to have mandatory content filtering, and I'm very concerned about that regarding the surveillance factor. So, your thoughts on that?
If any of our panelists have been looking at it, you haven't been. Has anyone from the audience been looking at so that we can start maybe more of a conversation as well? Yeah.
I mean, just something very, very briefly about. So I think you're right. So what I understand, particularly Article 13 of the Copyright Directive, to do is to flip around our normal presumptions in terms of content being uploaded first and then maybe subject to some notice and takedown process. And the way Article 13 is drafted now is to flip that around and essentially require the platforms to prevent the availability of unlawful content or violative content in one way or another. So there's very serious problems about that for the reasons that you mentioned, although I think it'd be interesting to spell out how that has implications for surveillance. But it certainly has implications in intellectual property for how we think about our, what has developed over the last 20 years or so of a pretty vibrant notice and takedown process, and what it means if platforms have a requirement to prevent the uploading, essentially, of content, and what it means to filter content in that way. I mean, I'd be interested to hear more about how you think that has implications for surveillance, but it certainly, I think, has implications for freedom of expression, and maybe particularly artistic expression. And then if we go beyond that to thinking about how the use of filters and their development in one particular case might have a kind of spillover effect into other areas of online life.
So yeah, regarding the surveillance factor of it, I mean, filtering the uploading of content is a form of surveilling. You have to surveil everything that is uploaded to a platform. Concerning minorities in this case, for me, coming from an LGBT community, this would actually not be one thing that we could implement because we don't have the budget for that. So us as an LGBT online community would have to shut down. So this is a great problem for like all minorities. But I mean, regarding the surveillance factor, it's that filtering is a way of surveilling. So yeah.
Joanna, you wanted to respond as well?
Yeah, I'm not super aware of the specificities of the proposal on copyright. But what I wanted to add is that I've seen that now people are talking more about AI. There is a trend to connect this with filtering and surveilling content. And I think even like the technology doesn't reach that stage, but even if it does, it's gonna fail because it's gonna be programmed with the values for blocking content that we already have problems with human beings moderating, no? So be it for copyright purposes, be it for fake news purposes, be it for moral purposes, I see this trend very dangerous. And like we have been debating responsibilities of intermediaries in the internet for long years now, and this trend that okay, now AI is gonna solve everything is like the most equivocal thing that we could think about.
Thank you. Yes, got a question here in the front.
Yeah, so very powerful stories from different parts of the world. My name is Jahan. I'm from Pakistan. I represent Pasha and also Bolobhi. I know it's not a simple solution and also as David said, it's not a one-size-fits-all sort of solution. But are we all know the problems, and these ladies have pointed out exactly how severe the problems are. Are we looking at any short-term, mid-term, or long-term solutions to these problems? Because, yes, talking about it is important, but looking at how we can address them seems to be something that we should collectively be looking at.
Thank you so much for that question. Maybe I'll ask each of the panelists, Amalia, Nigat, and Joanna, maybe to talk a little bit more about the work that they're doing to respond to some of those problems and how they're integrating their findings into more concrete actions.
Well, in the case of Charisma, first of all, we are learning about how to mainstream gender in our work, first of all. That's the first thing we're doing. So to be able to make better assessment when we are looking into a new regulation, new draft law, or so on and so forth, you know. That's the first thing for us to understand. And also together, one part is just knowing how to do gender impact assessment, to say it in a way, but at the same time, we wanted to, I forgot what I wanted to say. No, but at the same time, we are trying to gather more evidence. That's what I wanted to say. We want to gather more evidence because we don't have it. As I say, this is just a surface. We were working with 25 female journalists, so it's just a very small sample, and we need to gather more evidence. So to somehow highlight to either the private sector but also the public sector, you know, this is what we have. You know, we have to base our decisions on the evidence, and this is what we have. Maybe we don't have the capacity to gather more evidence, but we can insist the other that have more resources than us to do something like that. You know, it's very difficult to have one solution, but it's a way we are looking for ways of helping to find new and more innovative solutions.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think that there are some like short-term and long-term solutions, and when we talk about like countries like ours, the long-term solution is to, you know, break stereotypes around social surveillance, and it will take years and years. Even starting the discourse and, you know, discussion around that is something very problematic for people to digest in. So and you as a very active stakeholder in Pakistan know that we have already started this discussion in terms of, you know, how the legislation looks like, but also in different communities, be it, you know, like civil society or the traditional human rights organizations or the tech companies, that how, you know, like the women's experiences in the social spaces, how we can sort of, you know, look into those experiences. We have produced like Charisma, a research of women journalist experiences of surveillance. So I think more groundbreaking research is needed so that we have evidence-based research to push for policy change, but also to start a discourse even within our own homes and, you know, like our circles. I know that as a feminist and human rights activist in Pakistan, when I talk about surveillance with human rights defenders, they have internalized and normalized it so much in their heads that they actually say, oh, no matter what you do, you know, like the agencies or the security agencies or the state will surveil them. So they have already, you know, like normalized this notion, and we really need to, you know, like sort of challenge this discourse and stereotype that, yeah, that there are some solutions and we can sort of. So I also think that the demand of respecting of one's privacy right should come from the public. And that's something that we are lacking in Pakistan, and that's because of the culture and tradition that we have.
Thank you, Niga. And then maybe Joanna, if you want to mention a little bit of the work that in Brazil.
So, sorry. The work that I've shown was more about mapping the playing field or tracking the changes from the governmental perspective of governmental surveillance and how it connects with the platforms and how the surveillance tools go beyond just the government tools. But there is another work that we are doing on storytelling, on surveillance capacities, not only from the state, but from this data capitalism that we live on. It's at another platform, chupadados.com, in which we flag some stories about state surveillance, but mostly about how platforms and the massive data collection for their business models operate to surveil us. And ultimately, it does lead to a lot of strategies on online gender violence and to a lot of experiences just as those mentioned by Nigat, or even targeting journalists, females or not. So then those two projects are projects in which we map the field, we try to tell stories about how this is pervasive, how surveillance is not state. It's very obvious, I think, for the audience here, but beyond the internet community, I think it's a lot work to do in terms of convincing people that privacy is not dead, that is not the discourse of you have nothing to hide doesn't apply. And so there is this part of the work that is about mapping and creating awareness, but then we do direct advocacy in the policy making field, but also digital security trainings, particularly focused on women as well and LGBTQI community. Brazil is one of the countries that has the highest rate of killing trans people, so we also focus a lot in that community. Thanks.
Before taking the next question, I just wanted to maybe reflect on what's already been said and also share some of the experience of Privacy International and the work that we do with our partners. And I think one of the things that keeps coming up and that was mentioned was around narratives and discourses. And I think as we're proceeding with our, the work that we're doing already, we need to be challenging those dominant narratives and using our own terms and stopping to use the terms being imposed on us by be it companies or governments, and defining security on our own terms. What does it mean for us? And I'm not saying at the national level, because as we saw, there's also local initiatives that need to be reflected. But we need to be rewriting that narratives and using it for our own benefits to advance our missions and values. The other one that was mentioned here as well, and I was on a panel yesterday with that was around research of perceptions of privacy in 8 African countries, and low level of awareness of people not being concerned about privacy. And for me, it was not surprising to see these low percentages, because when we know that it just reflects a lack of transparency as to what surveillance practices and policies are actually in place. So if you don't know how your right to privacy can be interfered with, then maybe you are not so concerned about that it is being because you don't even know it's happening. There's just, it's all operating a little bit in the shadows. No accountability of how these are being undertaken. And so unless we can break this cycle and to provide more information in the public as to what's being done supposedly in the name of national security or security more broadly, then it's going to be very hard for people to be aware of how it impacts them as well. So I think that's important. Any other questions?
So just to add on to what I was asking and the conversation, the surveillance on people who are activists or involved in this becomes worse because there are not enough voices talking about it. So perhaps, as you suggested yourself, that the awareness needs to be created perhaps where at university or school level, where kids need to be made aware of the fact that their privacy can be compromised, that there is surveillance going on constantly, that they need to be speaking up about it, because the more voices that are involved in this conversation, the more chances that policymakers will pay attention, especially with the voting age being 18 now in places like Pakistan, where they want that vote, and with elections happening, a few months from now, this is the right time perhaps for us all to get involved and try and see if we can get the young people to get involved in the conversation.
I completely agree, and one of the things that I know some of our partners are doing, and we're also trying to do, is not to also just work in our echo chamber, but some of the issues mentioned today are about social justice, about discrimination, about the rights of ethnic minorities, and civic engagement, democracy, and so we need to be liaising with those civil society organizations and those stakeholders engaging in these different fields as well, and making those connections between the rights that we're fighting for and the rights that they're fighting for as well, and the communities they're representing. Thank you. Any other comments? Yeah, a question at the back. Thank you.
Hello. We mentioned the importance of hacking technologies, intrusion softwares, and the hacking of the mobile phones. And I understood that there was one legal avenue to deal with the export of this kind of technologies from Western Europe. And I would like to know, what are your comments on the advancement of the Wassenaar arrangement? I guess I know that Privacy International is quite active in this avenue, so I would like to have your comments on this.
Yeah, so it is an area that we've been looking at for many years in terms of the problem analysis we'd identified is a lot of these technologies, the whole industry, the whole surveillance industry is operating in the shadows, and like some of the business and human rights standards that have been developing, the surveillance industry has not been part of those discussions. And so that is one area that we're trying to look at. And yes, the Wassenaar Agreement is one of those avenues. Having said that, it is a non-legally binding agreement as well, so there's more that needs to be done around that as well. But I think in terms of the work that we're doing, we need to be identifying, who is purchasing and who is selling. And at the moment, that's still, even though we have much more information than ever before, that's still something that's not being done openly, particularly in terms of who is buying as well. There are a few cases where we think it's a government that's buying, but then it could be a local authority. It depends who the adversary is in that context. But that is definitely an avenue that we're exploring beyond all the work that we're doing on human rights mechanisms. And in that respect, we're also trying to look at the surveillance industry itself, and trying to understand who are the actors and where there's leverage to be regulating those technologies that are being sold, particularly when they're being sold to governments that don't have, where there's no rule of law, there's no legal framework to ensure that the way these are going to be used, because some technologies have dual uses and could be used for lawful surveillance within a very restricted legal framework, when we know that they're being used to target various groups in society that should not be subject to surveillance, that's where it becomes problematic. Okay, I don't see any more questions from the audience, so maybe just to wrap up, I might ask the three speakers to maybe conclude with a few comments as to what they expect in terms of the change that they want to see next, in terms of supporting their efforts that they're doing with each of their organizations.
Yeah, I think I really want to see that the voices that are not being heard in spaces like IGF and like big spaces where we talk about digital rights of the people who are not here. I really hope that like these spaces give them space to voice their experiences, and also I feel that even like as like organizations who are working on digital rights, we are also learning. We are learning how to respond to these challenges and issues. So we at Digital Rights Foundation are trying to create and establish more evidence-based research, but also, like as Jahan said, like reaching out to the schools and universities, because when we are talking about changing the society, we really need to start from the beginning. So, like starting from schools and universities and our educational institute to change the mindset that we have been there for decades and decades. So yeah, I think it's not a, it's not a change that we are expecting, like overnight or in just a couple of years. It will take, like decades, because it's so integrated in our society to challenge these, stereotypes. Thanks.
Joanna?
Yeah, I totally agree with Nigat, and that's why I have been investing a lot in producing those stories, in storytelling, like getting the dating apps, analyzing their private settings, telling stories about how women have been harassed by not matching with someone, but then due to the fact that the databases are integrated with Tinder and Facebook, men are being able to connect them through Facebook, because Facebook suggests them to talk. So that's a way to jump out of consent that was embedded in the platform to harass the person in another platform due to this integration of databases. Or cases in which geolocalization in Tinder was used to attack LGBT community also. So bringing those issues, because surveillance is a word that is a scary word. This is a word that doesn't relate to everyday activities. But the fact is that the way that the interactions we are having with our digital devices and how the industry was built, that's based on data most of the time. We are all carrying our surveillance devices all over, no? But people don't relate to that, because the terminology surveillance relates more to activism or, So changing those narratives is being one of the part of the mandate within coding rights. And I think that could help us in the advocacy strategies as well.
Amalia?
Yeah, well, I don't know what else I can say after Nigab and Joanna, but definitely we need more voices and we need more people working on this from different sectors. Definitely the private sector can take a lot of advantage if it includes way more diversity in their teams. From decision making, but also from those that are developing technology. Also the government could be more inclusive and more diversity to think about the problems, to think about solutions, and not to try to restrict our rights, you know. And from our side, as I mentioned before, we need to keep learning how to make how to communicate more effectively and easily all these issues, so we have more allies from grassroots organizations and collectives.
Okay, so unless there are any final comments from the audience, we're going to conclude this session. In terms of what has been discussed and maybe some takeaways for all of us to take with us as we each go back to working on our different mandates and with our own principles and values, I think the intersectionality between all of these issues can't be ignored. And I think over the years it's been good to see within this forum, but also others, those working on digital rights and online rights, interacting with other organizations, maybe working on other issues that are emerging, be it gender issues, the rights of minorities, but also social justice, discrimination, civic engagement, and anything related really to our ability to engage in democratic processes as well. And so I think in terms of moving forward, we need to find ways of having more of those exchanges and looking for solutions together, so that if a new bill comes out on data protection, interception of communications, whatever it is, that we don't just have privacy advocates they're advocating, but other groups that will be impacted because of the expansive provisions that are included in those laws. And I think an important takeaway as well is telling our stories. We tend to, all be here at the IGF and, speaking within our echo chamber, but we need to be reaching out to others to be sharing the work that we're doing, the concerns, and seeing if there are commonalities that we can be working on together. So thank you very much to our three panelists and to David Gay, who joined us earlier in the panel. And thank you for all of you for your presence and attention. And thank you. Have a good day.